Dear festival, virtual festival audience, this is again Just Goes to Town, part of our discussion series or interview series we do for this year's festival, means Just Goes to Town 2021. And today I have here in the online Zoom space George Cremaschi, who is a bass player, composer, improviser from United States, but recently living in Czech Republic for almost 10 years or so.
Or more, even.
So hi, George.
Hi, Michal.
George is gonna perform at the festival on Wednesday, the 14th. Is that correct? Yes.
13th.
13th, yeah. On Wednesday 13th, with the band called Prague Improvisation Orchestra, with the special projects. PO, Prague Improvisation Orchestra, plays Charles Mingus, music of Charles Mingus, featuring German great trumpeter Axel Dörner. So that's one part of it. And then the second part of George's featuring at the festival is that George is actually doing a workshop on Saturday, 16th of October, and we're gonna get to it later in this interview. So yeah, so I start with the first question I prepared for you, George, and that's do you consider yourself as a jazz musician? And what is jazz for you? What do you think should a musician have to be considered as such, as a jazz?
Sure. I would say, out of respect for people who spend more time on jazz than I do, I would say I don't consider myself a jazz musician so much as I consider myself a musician who plays a lot of jazz and is quite interested in it and has a very, very long history with playing jazz. But since I'm often involved in projects, especially in the last maybe 15 years, that are not jazz oriented, let's say. So I try to make that distinction a little bit. Again, more out of respect for people who are full-time jazz musicians. But I think that background is pretty common. That's one of the reasons why we are inviting Axel Dörner for this, because I think he might give a similar answer as that. Where, I mean, certainly my primary interest in music and the motivation for me to play the double bass and to become an improviser was directly from jazz, which is something that we could talk about later, like how that happens.
Okay, and yeah, maybe I connect the second part of the question, which is like, what should a musician have to be considered as a jazz musician?
Sure.
The next question, which is like, how is your relation to the jazz tradition, to the tradition of American jazz music?
Sure. Well, that's what's interesting about that is it depends on who you would ask, for example, because unfortunately, a lot of the things that I'm interested in, some, or depending on where you are, some or even many jazz musicians and jazz writers, critics, etc., still consider some of the areas of interest that I have not really jazz, which is again maybe why my hesitancy then to call myself that, because so often someone thinks that something I'm doing is not jazz, let's say. So that's a whole issue which then comes up around the choice of Charles Mingus for this project for me. So it's really, again, it's difficult to say because, when I was younger and I was first playing, people like Ornette Coleman, Albert Ayler, Cecil Taylor at that time were considered part of the jazz tradition. And then the sort of neo-traditional element happened in the 80s, where then the active point was to say that wasn't jazz and to cut those things out. Whereas to me, there was a direct line. And finally, Ornette Coleman, I think, has been more accepted and is spoken about in schools, etc., because there's an obvious, let's say, swing feeling to that music. But sadly, in the year 2021, that this is still an issue. I would have never, if we had this interview 30 years ago, and we talked about this, I couldn't have imagined that in the year 2021 it would still be somehow an issue. Although I do feel in the last few years that that's maybe going away now. And certainly you and I have talked about this, that the new tradition, like the new generation of musicians who are in school now, I think now they are again sort of opening up to everything as being potentially part of this mix. So unfortunately, there's a lot of sort of politics around this, you know, because really the answer to your first question would be, yeah, I'm a jazz musician. But over time, you know, I've sort of had to sort of adjust to that, only because people tend to get offended and it becomes a sort of political topic in a certain sense. Again, all unfortunately for me, because all of this stuff is under the jazz umbrella, let's say. But again, not unlike other areas where, you know, people talk about this in classical music or in bluegrass or blues or whatever, that there are the traditional elements and then the avant-garde elements and the eternal sort of fight. You know, who are you in the tradition or not, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good, good. And yeah, like maybe this would be connected with the topic. Like I think like it's like you rarely play at the jazz festivals, right? In Czech Republic, that's correct.
That
So
is correct.
why do you think is it so? Like, do you think it's like the scene here is very like too conservative, or is there too huge gap between the scene you're sort of part of mostly and the jazz scene?
Well, I think a little bit of both. And, you know, part of it is also my own point of not necessarily outside of PO, Prague Improvisation Orchestra, outside of that group, I haven't put together any groups that had any overt sort of jazz content to them. So I haven't really approached very many festivals at the same time, let's say. So, you know, it's on one level, I feel like there hasn't been sort of anybody, like you're maybe the first person who knows me well, who like has reached out and invited me to do something. At the same time, you know, I also have not been focused on putting together groups that have an overt sort of jazz feeling to them. So it works in both ways. I do, you know, again, this is changing here, but until recently, there hasn't been a sort of automatic inclusion of more free improvisation stylistic elements in the jazz scene here, where certainly in Austria, Germany, France, the Netherlands, this is just in Scandinavia certainly, this has always been part of the jazz scene. So, for example, even in the mainstream jazz festivals like the Copenhagen Jazz Festival, there's almost always some representation of the more free elements as being part of the tradition. So that is true that is that dividing line here, but again, which is starting to go away more and more, but it's still there, I think, to some extent.
What about United States in this point?
Well, it's tricky. Kind of depends where you are and let's say who is the organizer. For example, you know, because in the United States since there's no Ministry of Culture there, the festivals are almost always funded by some commercial element, whether it's Mercedes-Benz or Amazon or whatever. And all of the major jazz festivals are funded in this way. Maybe in New York State, you get a little bit of money from the state, but it's mostly private ventures. And so then it really depends on the actual organizer and bookers and curators and how far they're willing to go in that sense. This is one of the ways that Europe is far superior to the United States in a cultural sense, is that here you're getting funded more by the government or local government agencies, and so you have more freedom, let's say, to choose what you want. When you have to answer to Mercedes-Benz or whatever, it's a sort of a different feeling. And so then it really then became, you know, like for example, the San Francisco Jazz Festival. In the many years I was living there, I played in the San Francisco Jazz Festival only a couple of times. And even those times were controversial, for example, because somebody was upset. And that's fully funded by big corporations. but then, there are events in New York and Chicago that, because the organizers are more open, that like the Vision Festival in New York City and the Chicago Jazz Festival, that are much more open, let's say.
Okay. So let's get closer to the actual concert of Pio at the festival.
Sure.
Maybe you can present a little bit the Pio, like what what is the goal of the ensemble?
Sure.
And
Well,
then,
okay.
let's start with this.
Okay. Well, this is the 9th year of Pio. We started in 2012, and the original goal still remains the same goal, which is to have a collective of musicians which is examining all areas of what we could call improvisation. So everything from free improvisation to like graphic scores to conceptual pieces to then actually moving into jazz and jazz areas. The group is never the same exact group of musicians. We sort of change it a little bit from project to project, depending on a variety of things. Who's available? Sometimes people are just even not available. Mostly they're musicians based in Prague, but we have musicians coming from Slovakia and regular guests sometimes from Austria and Germany as well. Mainly we're based around Prague, and a couple of longtime members are living in Brno. And so it really depends, So we take the word improvisation in a wide sense, which means that it could mean a variety of different things. And each year we do 5 or 6 concerts, and usually each one is slightly different, and can have a different concept. For example, in July we're doing 3-day small festival here in Prague, and each evening will be a completely different concept and different musicians. So now the Mingus project came from, now we have a ongoing series. We did last year, we did one this year, and the next year, which is an examination of a specific jazz composer. And last year we did Anthony Braxton, who is more, he's just celebrated his 75th birthday last year, and is quite well known as an experimental and avant-garde composer and band leader, but was essential in the whole sort of fight around what the tradition would be or not. Although now he was been inducted into the Jazz Hall of Fame or whatever they call it at Lincoln Center, so obviously he's been finally accepted, let's say, and so then this year we're doing Charles Mingus. We wanted to go really into someone who is unquestionably, obviously Mingus by any definition is one of the handful of greatest jazz composers, without question. And to see what to do with that, because that is, that's a big challenge, I think, what we're trying to do, which is, not necessarily do something that hasn't been done before, but is rarely done with Mingus's music, which is kind of try to examine it from a sort of outside of the Ellington tradition that I think people typically approach his music, and maybe go in a little bit more or a lot more for the more raw elements, let's say, and how to translate his compositions from let's say different perspectives, rather than from the inside of his music, which is rather than emphasizing the heavy swing elements, looking at the harmonic implications and the melodic implications and seeing where those can go, let's say. I don't know if that's clear, but
yeah, it sounds interesting. I hope everyone is as excited as I am. So, I will ask you about the Axel, actually. Axel Lerner, the great trumpeter. Like you've been collaborating with him even with Pio before, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
Like what is like, because to me he's a very special musician in like a worldwide context. So I would maybe ask you like, what's like if you find him special as well, and in which way.
Sure, sure. Yeah, Axel is really for me the perfect guest for this project. I mean, if I would have had my chance to ask anyone, he would actually be the first person on the list. So I'm happy that he said yes and that he's available and interested because he's his main importance, let's say, is as one of the most recognized people of the 90s Berlin improvisation generation, which was really on its surface level completely anti-jazz and anti-free jazz, let's say. And, when I first heard him play 20 plus years ago, he was playing extremely quiet music and music that was consciously the sort of everyone within the movement. There's a lot of texts that have been written about it, so I'm not imagining that there's a whole book based around this whole sort of movement, the Echtzeit music movement, which was specifically and verbally against all of what they felt were the excesses of post-jazz free improvisation, volume, intensity, a lot of loud saxophones and drums, etc., a sort of masculine energy, as people were calling it. And it was a sort of direct reaction to that. And I was actually very surprised, but not so surprised after meeting him and talking with him, to find out later that he had been, and he has continued a professional jazz career parallel to being this other musician the whole time. He was always been a professional jazz musician and very serious. That could have been just his career if he wanted to focus on that. As a trumpeter, he's one of the best contemporary jazz musicians in Germany, for my taste. So he manages both things, and for me, it's the perfect person for this job. Because Mingus's music is technically demanding, so this is one of the issues. You can't sort of superficially decide you're going to do some Mingus music. This is the difficult task here. Maybe where some other jazz composers that I would consider for a project like this, you can be less of an experienced jazz musician and maybe touch on it. With Mingus, it's like it's as intense jazz music as you can find. So to do the project justice, you really need to understand the music from the inside. You can't just touch on it. But yet Axel has this whole history of being somebody who is thinking completely outside of that. So someone who can combine the two together is really the perfect formula.
So, let's get now to the workshop you're doing
Yeah, sure.
on Saturday, because it's a workshop which is open to everyone, like all instruments, voice or whatever, I guess.
Sure.
So I would ask like, what will this workshop be concretely about, and if you think it's possible to learn someone how to improvise, and what is important in that process of learning.
Sure. Well, the workshop will be, basically what we'll focus on, and it will be a little improvised depending on who shows up, right? So some situation like this, you even extend the improvisation into how depending on who shows up, what instruments they play. Because, for example, if 4 double basses, a cello, and a flute come, what do we do? And so the idea is, well, I'm going to introduce the sort of, how to, because I think people are often intimidated by free improvisation from the perspective of, like, they think that you can make any choice, and when you can make any choice, it's kind of intimidating. So the idea in any workshop like this is to sort of break down the basic elements that we're working with and introduce sort of starting techniques and starting viewpoints of how do you get together with a group of 6 or 7 or 10 people that you have never played with before, or at least not in that context, and what's the first step? So I try to give people ways to think about how to relate to the other instruments around you, how to view it, because I think most, especially young musicians, are used to thinking about the role of their instrument within the music that they're playing normally. So if they're a drummer, they're thinking about the role that the drummer plays when there's a bass player and a saxophone player and a guitar player there. But what happens when that isn't there and you don't have some compositions which tell you what to play? How to now view the context and the other musicians, and what then is the possibility of your instrument. So starting with that, and then there are very simple techniques to use to start to build ideas of how to play together freely and how to view it as, okay, you played one sound. What's the next sound you can play? What is the relationship between the sounds of everyone around you, and how to make it fun, and remove the intimidation factor, let's say.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we stick with the topic a little bit, and like, how to formulate this? Like, do you think that and I'm not asking because I don't have my own answer for this question, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, sure.
But like, do you think that it's necessary to learn to improvise, or do you think are there people who are like naturally improvisers, or it's just like necessary to learn it as well as any other way of performing music?
Sure. I think that it's important to, there must be, if we take person A and person B and just put them in a room with some instrument that they've never played before, maybe person A will be more naturally talented at that, just as maybe person B is more naturally talented at riding a horse or whatever, being a gardener. So yeah, I think there are various, the differences between people. But I generally tend to reject thinking this way in general. I think all people can learn how to improvise regardless. And I think that your ability, how well you can improvise finally is going to really be only dependent on your own imagination, your own, limitations of your own, because really it's not about, the beautiful thing about improvisation is it's less about instrumental technique than it is about you understanding what you can do on your instrument and understanding the context that you can put it in. So as we see at the hybrid session that we're doing, there are some musicians who clearly can't play in the way that we would say to somebody, oh yeah, she can't play or he can't play or whatever, in some snobby sense, but yet they get on stage and they know the three things that they can do really well, and they find places to put those three things. Whereas maybe somebody with all the technique in the world, but who isn't listening and isn't focused and present, might not improvise very well. So I think it's more a question of understanding how, again, like as I was talking about the workshop, what your relationship is to the moment and to the people around you, and how well you're listening to what is happening, let's say. And I know that's a phrase that gets overused, to listen. And then I think musicians also go, well, what does that mean? I'm hearing what people are doing, but really to be focused on improvisation, you have to be present in the present moment. Right. You have to be fixed in the present moment in a way that if you're playing a composition, you're also fixed in the moment, but your attention is distracted by this piece of paper, so your sort of brain is separated in two. But I think when you're free improvising, the idea is to be just fully immersed in the sound that's happening, and you have to be listening to what but you're also in 3 time frames at the same time. You have to remember what already happened. You have to be present in the moment and then you have to be thinking about the future to develop a sort of compositional flow. And that's one thing that I didn't say about the workshop, sort of establishing that you're making a composition in real time. Right. So it's not just about being completely just present in the moment and just making sounds that don't have any relationship to the present and the past, but also understanding that you are sort of instantly composing something. And so to keep track of that. And I think really the best improvisers are not necessarily the best musicians. They're just the best at understanding these elements and how they fit together.
Right. And like as a listener, what do you think, like for you, what makes a good improvisation good, or like what makes the difference between a good or an average improvisation?
Sure, sure. Well, that's a really tricky, that's a very tricky question because it's again would really depend on one, for me personally, since I don't have a stylistic bias, and this is an important point because for some people, let's say for like hardcore, like a free jazz improviser from New York, maybe for them, the point is some intensity and a saxophone that's or really loud, or then maybe like somebody who's a quiet improviser who likes electronics, maybe for that person. So I think it also depends if you're bringing a stylistic bias into your listening. For me, I try to not have that bias, and so for me, if three musicians get on stage, like for example, I think of the duo that we had at the last Hebrew session. They were two violin players who had sort of similar backgrounds, and so they were quoting composed music and some Baroque element at some point. And I loved that because for me, they were just using the language elements that they had together. And so for me, that's important. I can imagine other people wouldn't like that because they would say like, well, that's too easy, or I don't know what sort of criticism one might have. But I could imagine someone who has maybe more of a stylistic bias. So for me personally, it's really just, do I feel like these musicians are in the moment and using the tools that they have to create a dialogue or conversation between them? Or are they trying to present their stylistic, their style, which then, that's a point of debate, I would say, right? I don't like necessarily when people try to push their style while improvising, because for me, then now I feel like you're not really listening, and maybe I would rather hear that person just play a composition at that point. It's a tricky area, but it kind of depends on each person, I would say.
Yeah, and do you follow the same values when you listen jazz music, like, or is it different? Like it's like when you're a jazz musician, you have to, like, there are different things which matter.
Sure, sure. Well, again, no, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking idealistically, and then in the moment when I'm actually listening to it, I bring. But I really try to hear. I try to determine what is the viewpoint of the people who are playing when I'm listening to something. What do I think they're trying to tell me, rather than what do I need to hear? And that's a lifelong thing because it's, I think that you have to start at a certain point and establish that. In other words, if it doesn't, if I need to hear some specific thing, well, then I should put together my own band and play that thing. I don't want to put my values on top of the thing that I'm listening to. I think it's only fair to give whoever's playing, whatever you're listening to, the space to present their case to you, right? In a sense. And so I don't have that much patience for people who will listen to something and then criticize it from the perspective of, well, what would they do if they were playing that music? It's really only fair to listen to music on the terms that they're presenting it to you on. Which then becomes, when I do criticize, let's say, jazz musicians, it would be that I think that they are trying to do what they think others want to hear from them. That's one of the problems of being, let's say, stuck in some traditional mode where you've decided or others have decided for you, well, this is the music, right? And then but what is your opinion about the music that you're playing? I don't want to hear, and I understand that everybody can't be an original and everybody can't be John Coltrane. That's completely understood. That's actually a tradition in jazz that I think is not a good tradition. This idea of the greats are always the great innovators. And so then we're all living under the shadow of Ellington and Coltrane and Miles forever. And then I think people get afraid because it's like, well, who am I? I mean, I'm not Miles. So, but I think that people that's the danger of this rigid, in a sense, tradition of the greats, and we all follow the greats. It's one reason why I've waited, 30 years to do a project around Mingus because I'm so intimidated just as a bass player. Like, are you kidding? I mean, arguably still the greatest technical bass player in the history of jazz. And, you know, there are plenty of people who were just as good as him on some level. But certainly at that time, and so and I could imagine somebody saying it, like, who the hell does he think he is? I mean, he can't. And I'm sure that somebody might hear what we end up doing with his music, and that might upset, how they can't do that, And that's one of I think, a problem within jazz is that on the one hand, you have this incredibly rich tradition, but then people are intimidated by that tradition and feel like they're not worthy to put in their own voice. But that's what I want to hear. I want to hear your opinion on this music. And then we can decide if it worked or it didn't work. But I don't like to enter the room with expectations of, well, you're not Miles, so, don't think that you're going to do that. And that's one of the problems with this sort of hero hierarchy, let's say, which is, it's good and bad at the same time, right? It has its good elements and then it has its dangerous elements.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. I would have one more question. Maybe let's get back to the political stuff, but not so much political. But I would be interested about some kind of comparing of the jazz and maybe also improvised music scene in Czech Republic with the scenes which are kind of more developed, like you mentioned the Western countries in Europe, like Germany,
sure,
and Scandinavia,
sure,
but also maybe United States, which is also quite like very interesting, of course, both jazz and improvised scene. Like, how would you compare the scenes, and like what do you think is like necessary to happen for the Czech scene to become a little bit more known than it is right now?
Well, I think to answer the last part of the question first, certainly what it would take to become more known is, I think, more musicians taking seriously the last part of the answer to the last question that I said, where people get away from thinking that they can't make, let's say, their own statement within the music, and where there's more of a. I mean, it's tricky because how can I say? Because it's difficult to compare to other countries, let's say Germany, Austria, because jazz musicians were maybe allowed here in the socialist time, but were somewhat persecuted, in fact, in a way that they weren't persecuted, let's say, in the GDR, which for whatever reason was promoting jazz and free jazz musicians. So, it's difficult even within the socialist country context, or in Poland where they were more openly supporting musicians, but here for some reason jazz musicians were disliked. I mean, we know the reason, but we don't have time to talk about it. But so it's trickier here because there's not really a strong tradition to work from, let's say. And so there's still a lot of catch-up being played here, in a sense where, in Berlin, in East Berlin, there isn't that catch-up because there was always this connection with Western musicians. And a lot of the great musicians played there in a way that they were not playing here. So I think that the sooner that musicians here just forget about that and realize that that they're potentially the equal of anyone, I think that will help move it forward in a way, because there's always that danger of everything being just a sort of jazz revival, in a sense, right? In this way that we're recreating something here that never really developed and never really happened here, in a sense. And that's sort of a tricky thing. Whereas, of course, if you're if you're born in New York City and playing there, well, you're automatically part of the tradition somehow, which is dangerous on another level, because I think sometimes musicians in New York can be really arrogant in a way that I don't like. just somehow, well, I'm great because I'm in New York, and it's the opposite of, can be the opposite of effect. Um, but what I see in, you know, what I see in younger musicians here is exactly sort of, let's say, the conditions to make it better, where I think that there's much more curiosity about all of the things that, let's say, are unknown. Because jazz really still has a huge unknown history to me here. When I have conversations with jazz musicians here, I feel like there are large areas of what I take for granted as jazz history, and not just avant-garde history. I'm even just the traditional history, large areas that are really unknown. You know, if I say Big Sid Catlett to some young musician, they have no idea who's Big Sid Catlett. And he's like, you know, one of the greats of the 30s in jazz drumming, right? So there are a lot of holes in ways that I think that most jazz musicians in the US are more knowledgeable, let's say, about the history in general. And again, that's because there's not such a direct link here to a lot of those things. But it's, you know, more, and as time goes on, there's much more and more history, etc. So, because a young musician can say to me, like, well, what about Mark Turner? And I don't know a lot about Mark Turner, so I'll admit that, you know, there are holes in everybody's knowledge. And at a certain point, trying to know everybody, there's not enough time.
And do you think like jazz music is still kind of live culture in terms of the tradition is still like in some kind of continuum? It still goes on, or do you think it's rather like something which happened and now you can only mix parts of the history?
Sure, sure. No, I think that it is ongoing, as I'm continually surprised. I mean, last year when I went to Jazz Goes to Town, I thought that the concerts that I heard were obviously showing new areas that are being considered as jazz, which is really the main. Again, it's sort of the main important point is that new influences and new directions need to be accepted as part of the language. And this is an ongoing, you know, because it's not just Albert Ayler or Anthony Braxton that have been sort of rejected from jazz influence. The same person might say that fusion is not really jazz, or etc. I mean, there are a lot of areas of music that have happened in the last 50 or 60 years. Even just to mention Miles Davis, there are still people who hate the whole electric period, which to me is actually my favorite Miles Davis music. But to say that is sort of blasphemous to jazz purists. Like, how can you call that jazz? 60 years later, it's still difficult to call some of that music jazz for people, or 50 years later, I should say. Um, so, you know, but what, again, it's really a sort of a generational thing. I think now when I speak to 20 and 25-year-olds, they don't have this problem. And for me, this is the main issue around whether the scene here will be more accepted from the outside, more recognized from the outside or not. Is the, you know, is the viewpoint expanding and open, or is it a rigid tradition that you have to fit inside?
Right.
If it, you know, in whatever culture that jazz has been kind of pushed into a sort of rigid box, that's when not very much is going to happen. I hate to say it.
Yeah, I have one rather personal question, because I think there is a lot of people around uh, here or in Europe in general who at some point they decide to go to New York because they want to, because there is a strong scene of everything in New York, right? Not just
Sure.
the jazz music, which is obvious, but also for improvised music, for any kind of art. It's sort of the
Yeah.
central place to be. And there is a lot of people from Europe who wants to go there to reach, to like be in that environment. And you did the opposite. Like you decided to go to the country which no one really knows for its improvised music or whatever. So
Sure, sure.
do you regret it sometimes, or like what is your point like to this choice? Like how does it-
Well, I mean, I don't, any large decision that one can make in their life, I suppose later you can assess it and make regrets or not. But for me, and I know this might be sort of disillusioning for young musicians, but for me, New York already by the time I moved, which is in the late 80s, because I moved to California first and I lived there for many years and then moved here. New York had, and New York was already sort of, there were two problems. One was economic, that, you know, having grown up in a very cheap and dangerous at that time New York City, as it became more and more expensive and more difficult to live there, it sort of was losing interest for me to spend so much of my life worrying about money all the time. But then also at that time, there were very few paying gigs, and probably now even less paying gigs. And I don't know. I mean, I guess I have it, the position, because someone who arrived in New York in the year 2000 can say the same thing, like, well, now it's so much more expensive. So it's always better in the old days. I understand that. But for me, I felt like the real creative energy that I felt in New York was already on its sort of way down, already in the late 80s. But again, that's my perspective, having grown up there and been involved in the scene there at that time. And sure, there are always moments that I wish I had lived there longer, or I wish that I would be able to work or play there longer. But I try not to think about that too much. I mean, for me, it's always been a question of where can I work on the things that I'm interested in working on, and that can really happen anywhere. I mean, one of the reasons I decided to stay here, because when I was first living in Europe, I wasn't sure if I would stay here or maybe move to Berlin or maybe move to Austria, and I spent a lot of time in various places. I actually decided that I wanted to stay here and wanted to sort of help the scene grow here, because I felt like that was more interesting in a sense than arriving in a place that already there were thousands of musicians and just being a part of a larger scene. I actually found that like an interesting challenge. And I feel like that between, me and Petr Verba at the time, who's the co-founder and co-leader of Pio, so I should have mentioned him earlier. We founded it together. The idea, we've been always running it together. And, the idea of the group started from conversations that I had with him over several years, discussing how the scene at that time was almost nil here in a lot of ways. And in terms of more adventurous music, let's say, there was a very traditional jazz scene, but even that wasn't so big. There's been a real explosion of all areas that I'm interested in, not just jazz and improvised music, but also contemporary classical music, which is pretty strong scene here now. And all of these things have grown in the last 10 years or so quite intensely. But that was, people consciously talking about it and saying, well, what strategies do we have to make it better? What are we going to do to make it better? And for me, that's been an exciting project, let's say, to be involved in something that is clearly growing and clearly getting bigger and better was, so that was a conscious choice from that perspective. I don't know if I would have made that choice 20 years ago or not. But really, when I looked around 10 years ago and I thought, well, do I want to just be another person in a large scene, or is it more exciting to stay here and help work on this scene? And I don't regret that choice at all. I think it's really an exciting time here, I think. There are a lot of great young musicians. And even seeing older musicians sort of, open up their approach a little bit has been gratifying. The idea is, how to do it in a way that's not confrontational. I mean, people take their choices in art very seriously, and I take them seriously also, but I don't like when it's so political. I'm not interested in that. We have enough politics in politics, right? For me, it's just like, I'll play with anybody. I'll talk to anybody. I don't, and I think that that's been overall one of my larger goals, let's say, which is like, everybody should talk to everybody, right? Why not that Michal Rataj, who's a more neoclassical or like post-classical composer, is writing music for jazz musicians now, right? That's not my influence necessarily, but that's this idea that people can reach, just to think of one good example, et cetera, et cetera.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so I would finish with the last question, which would be about your recent and maybe even like future goals and projects. Like what you're up to, like what is your plans, and it can also be like more general and more up
Sure.
for long term.
Well, no, speaking about sort of a spin-off from Pio, I just started recently a jazz quartet, like very consciously going back into that with Marcel Barta, Wojciech Prochaska, and Elia Moretti. All four of us will be playing in the Mingus project also. And that's really just a conscious attempt to go back after many years of not really having a regular working jazz group, to going back to that with a sort of, I don't know what the still trying to decide exactly, but the perspective is really finding, rather than having like a position in a group where I'm composing for it or anything like that. We're really just taking it song by song and just finding songs that we really like and examining them in whatever way we want, right? And so back to the idea of, that the compositions themselves are, finding interesting compositions themselves rather than, let's say, this standard idea that happens in jazz where there's a standard repertoire and we draw from that. There are so many interesting compositions, so many interesting composers that people have forgotten about, or even within, let's say, the works of some specific composer, like Monk. Everybody plays the same 5 Monk songs, right? Like, how about we dig into the corner and find those 1 or 2 that no one ever plays, etc. So that's really sort of a nice, after so many years of not having a working jazz group, going in, and so that's one project that I started. And others have been, the last year and a half, have been actually playing online with people from around the world. And I have 2 different projects that I've been working on in this way, where because the software has reached the point where you maybe can't play written music with someone in Singapore or California, but you can free improvise because it's it's off 10 milliseconds, but no one's going to really know exactly. And so I've been working on that and working on a couple of releases from sort of accumulated recordings of the last year and a half. I mean, now that we can go back to playing together live, this isn't necessarily a concern, but it is a nice way. One of the things about living here is that the friends that I have in New York or California or other parts of the world, I don't get to play with them very often. And so I'm actually interested in this possibility for the future, that actually I can continue working with people online. This technology already existed before, but now, sort of through the pandemic, programmers really stepped up and pushed it further. And actually the next step will be that there will be some way to actually play in time, that the software itself will judge the latency and mix everything together. That's sort of the next step for the people who are doing this. Anyway, so I'm interested in these concepts again, also because at the same time, as much as it's great to play together live, we all have to understand, like, we can't travel as much as we used to, et cetera, for sort of climate reasons, et cetera. So I've gotten more and more interested in this. Virtual reality is not really a good substitute for actually getting together in person, as we know.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's been sort of an ongoing interest as well.
Okay. Cool. So thanks a lot for beautiful answers.
Sure. I probably talked too long a lot, so you're gonna have to edit some of that. Sorry.
We leave everything. But yeah, I just have to say one more thing, and that is that everyone can buy the tickets at Go Out, and you can also find all the information about the festival at Just Goes to Town website, which is jgtt.cz. And once again, I'm inviting everyone for the concert of Pure Orchestra or Prague Improvising Orchestra featuring Axel Derner in the project of music by Charles Mingus, which is on the Wednesday 13th of October, and it's gonna also at the same night there's gonna be a beautiful trio with also one New Yorker featuring Brian Cherrett on the Hammond organ, Ondřej Šteráček on tenor saxophone, and Dana Šoltis on drums. So it's gonna be a very nice evening, and
Super.
looking forward to see you there. And thank you one more time, George, for
You're welcome. My pleasure, Michal.
and hope to see you soon. Bye.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao.